Professor Wiseman.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I want to apologize to the Francophone members of the committee because I don't have comprehension or facility in French. I want to point out I didn't hear all the testimony of the witnesses who've gone before me because I only found out on Monday evening that I was coming. And I thank you for your patience because I know it's hard to sit in on sessions right at the end of the day, and it's been a long day for you. I don't have to tell you that, and you know this, the overwhelming majority of academics, editorialists, of course the opposition parties, election officials, and representatives of various groups have criticized the Bill C-23, and they claim it abridges Canadian democracy and the constitutionally entrenched right to vote. Now, elections acts are fundamentally different, I believe, than from other forms of legislation such as trade treaties, budgets, or the bills dealing with veterans, drugs, and agriculture, which are currently being considered before Parliament. Election acts have a quasi-constitutional status, and therefore it's best to gain a consensus, as Professor Thomas said, among those affected by the introduction of such acts, something this government hasn't tried to do. Having said that, I'm not sure earlier governments have done it either. I believe when the law was changed with respect to election financing in 2003, there wasn't even consensus in the governing party that did it. And the president of that governing party referred to the change as a bag full of hammers, if I recall. Now, among the most controversial provisions of this bill are the elimination of vouching, limiting what Elections Canada may say and do, party finance, which we've heard a fair bit about, and transferring the office of the Commissioner of Elections from Elections Canada to the Director of Prosecutions. Let me begin by talking about vouching. In the last election, depending on whose numbers you use, I think in Professor Thomas's brief he used 100,000 as having vouched for. More recently we're hearing 120,000. This means that somewhere between 99.2 and 99.4% of voters did provide identification. So we're not dealing with a huge number of people, percentage terms. And this is one reason why politically vouching doesn't resonate with most of the public. Now, according to one table published by Elections Canada, and I think this is in the compliance review, although I heard Mr. Mayron use a different number, 5 of the provinces, including the 3 largest, in those provinces, electors must prove their identity to vote in provincial elections. So I would suggest the federal requirement is not exceptional. Now, people say this isn't a good comparison, but let me make it. People are required to provide identification when they drive a car, board a plane, or visit a doctor. And asking a passenger in your car to vouch for you isn't going to suffice. I know that voting is a constitutional right, but it's reserved for citizens, and the identification bar is a lot less demanding than that. I would also point out that rights are not absolute. They may entail limitations and obligations. For example, we have the right to free speech, but we're limited when it comes to hate speech. We have the right to free speech, but we can't cry wolf in a crowded theater. These are reasonable limitations. And I would also point out that citizens, just as they have the right to vote, have the right to run in elections. And that's regulated by law. Consider all the paperwork that one has to do to run in an election. Compare that to what one has to provide to vote in an election. An elections expert in my department, Peter Lowen, who has worked for Elections Canada as well, I never have, he calculates that the elimination of vouching may advantage a party, possibly, theoretically, if at all, by 1/10 of a percentage point at most. Now, such a narrow margin, as you know, determines very few, if any, constituency contests and makes dubious the claim that eliminating vouching will be of significant benefit to a party. I do, however, believe that although about 10% of the voter identification cards have errors, disqualifying them as a form of identification is an unnecessary change and it will confuse, anger, and frustrate many voters. My own experience in 2011 when I went to vote in the federal election is I presented my driver's license, and that was rejected by the poll clerk because I didn't have my voter identification card. I made noise, the polling supervisor got up and overruled her. But what I'm pointing out in a way is that, look, running elections it's an amateur undertaking. 226,000 people are elected. The problem we have is finding people to serve as clerks. Now, I haven't heard much about the provision about incumbent MPs nominating poll supervisors, but I've seen academics write about it, so I might be wrong about all the details in the bill. My understanding is that incumbent MPs will nominate poll supervisors, and I believe the candidates of the losing party in the previous election will nominate the poll clerks. Is that correct? And my understanding is this isn't anything new. I believe this was the practice during most of the 20th century. The real challenge that Elections Canada faces is finding sufficient numbers of poll officials who aren't amateurs. Elections Canada's faced the same challenge in finding door-to-door enumerators before the 1990s and cited this as one reason to move to a permanent voters list. Moreover, I would say there's no evidence to substantiate the assumption that poll supervisors nominated by incumbent MPs will not act honestly. If I could quote a member of the other house, poll supervisors and polling clerks are not your enemies. They're your neighbors. These are good people. In any event, the incumbent party only holds just 52% of the seats in the House of Commons. I believe Elections Canada should focus on running elections, not to proselytize the virtues of voting. If voting turnout is of great concern to you as parliamentarians, you could offer them tax credits. You're offering families $500 to have their kids go bowling or horseback riding. Or you could take the advice of one of your former colleagues, Senator Harper, and make voting mandatory. Or you could impose a fine. Citizens have a right to vote, but they also have an equal right not to vote. And they ought not to be badgered about having to go out to vote at their own expense. In any event, I believe there isn't any gain for democracy by encouraging know-nothings to cast a ballot and telling them it doesn't matter who you vote for so long as you vote. It does matter who you vote for. If you're going to vote for a racist, I prefer you stay at home. Better yet, maybe you should leave the country. So people who go to vote, who know nothing about the election, and all we want to do is increase voter turnout, this is an empty gesture. I don't think that contributes to democracy. I want to say some other things about Elections Canada because I've gotten a lot of their reports. I can't read all of them, and some of them I found very useful. But what I've noticed is that over the decades, Elections Canada has become a large bureaucracy. It produces, in my opinion, maybe many unnecessary and costly reports that are of questionable utility by private firms who are the major beneficiaries. Let me give you a couple of examples. After the last election, and I think Elections Canada hired about 1,000 so-called community relations officers who were hired to liaise with so-called disadvantaged groups. One firm, one of the largest polling firms in Canada, private firm, when they sent surveys out to 863 of these officers, only 308 could even be bothered to respond. And unsurprisingly, what did we find? That the program for which they were hired they thought was helpful. Well, what would you expect? And do we need to pay for that? Here's another survey that was done. A questionnaire after the 2008 election by another contracted private firm found that hardly any of the 63 media respondents, and they canvassed about 200 journalists, hardly any of the 63 canvassed had used the audio clips, video footage, or pre-written stories provided by the agency. So the agency put all this money into producing these products, Virtually no journalists tuned into them, and then a private firm is hired to find out that information. What gain to the public? Elections Canada has also produced some misleading material. In the 2004 election, they ran ads in all the newspapers in Canada saying if you're not on the voters list, you can't vote. And to get on the voters list, you got to run down to your returning office. Well, I knew that wasn't the case. I knew that I could vote if I showed up on election day with proper identification. But the ads gave the impression that you could not. I resented that. I went down and registered, but I also pointed it out. And of course they said you can show up. I said, and vote if you've got proper ID. Why wasn't that in the ad? Increasing the contribution limit by individuals from $1,500 to from $1,200 to $1,500, I believe, is of little significance. But I think there are large financial issues. And this is the money that fuels campaigns that are conducted before the writ period. We seem to be in a permanent campaign now. And I think we should require, as the Chief Electoral Officer says, parties to produce supporting documentation. This is the case in the various provinces, especially because their expenses are taxpayer subsidized. I think there's also an unfair advantage to parties and their candidates. They have an unfair advantage over independent candidates who may only issue tax receipts during the writ period. Now, the exclusion of a provision compelling witnesses to testify in cases of alleged fraud or voter interference, I believe, is the greatest failure of this bill. Restricting Elections Canada's ability to communicate publicly suspected incidents of fraud, I believe, compounds this problem. The Commissioner of Elections, yes, will continue to investigate, and I believe it's in his power to recommend charges if warranted. But if information regarding investigations that deal with electoral malfeasance is unreported, that, it seems to me, would only encourage more misconduct. It was only after Elections Canada reported that it was investigating voter interference in Guelph that many electors came forth in over 200 other constituencies to contact authorities. So on balance, I believe the new bill will have little effect on the running of elections and the outcome of elections. I am uncomfortable about the Commissioner of Elections budget being subject to the Treasury Board approval, because that's a way of starving him from pursuing investigations where I think they have to go. The greatest shortcomings of the bill, in my opinion, aren't what it does, it's what they don't include. In that sense, I think the bill is unfair.
Thank you, Professor.